I have been dead for 7 years, 3 months, and 16 days. The Imperium, in its vast, indifferent cruelty, simply has not bothered to inform my physical form yet. The colossal iron door groans shut behind me, the sound a sickening echo, like bones shattering in unison. And in that definitive clang, I knew with absolute certainty that I would never again gaze upon the pale, dwindling light of Tertius Prime's dying sun. The guards, with their impassive faces, didn't bother to recite my crimes aloud. They were irrelevant now, swallowed by the maw of this place. Heresy, sedition, the inexplicable failure to meet tithe obligations, the cardinal sin of speaking against a planetary governor's nephew who wore the uniform of the Astro Militarum like a child's gaudy costume to a masquerade. All these charges blurred into an indistinguishable mass of transgressions. Here, in this submerged hell, guilt and innocence are but quaint notions, concepts that belong only to the world above, that distant, almost mythical realm where people still cling to the belief in justice and the possibility of redemption. Down here, in the unholy bowels of Penitentia Maxima, there is only the stark, unyielding truth of endurance. The intake chamber reeked of a harsh disinfectant mixed with the metallic tang of fear sweat, a truly noxious combination that not only seared the nostrils, but also lingered at the back of the throat, a chilling premonition of the sickness and degradation yet to come. Hundreds of us stood packed together in ragged lines, stretching far beyond the reach of the flickering, half-dead lumen strips. Our shackles, heavy and cold, clinked together in a despondent rhythm, a sound that strangely mimicked prayer beads being worked through the desperate, trembling fingers of the doomed. Beside me, a gaunt merchant, whose misfortune it was to be caught selling counterfeit devotional candles, wept silently. His tears, hot and useless, fell onto the grimy, stained concrete floor, instantly vanishing without a trace, absorbed by stone that had already drunk the moisture and despair of 10,000 souls before him. The servitor tasked with cataloging my very existence had, I could tell, once been human. Its face was a grotesque mosaic of decaying flesh and crudely affixed metal plates. One eye socket was empty, replaced by a raw optical scanner that whirred and clicked with chilling precision as it meticulously examined my features. The other eye, though, still organic, still disturbingly human, fixated on me with an expression that might, in a saner world, have been interpreted as pity, if, that is, such fragile emotions were allowed to survive the gruesome lobotomization process that created these unthinking drones. It pressed its cold, metallic fingers against my throat, a mechanical intrusion, registering my pulse, my body temperature, and the subtle chemical signatures that would, one day, serve to identify my corpse. Inmate 779588, it droned, in a voice like grinding gears, utterly devoid of inflection. Classification, political. Subclassification, sedition, minor. Estimated survival duration, 8 to 12 standard months. 8 to 12 months. They had already etched the date of my demise into their cold ledgers long before I had even glimpsed the confines of my cell. The uniform they issued me was a drab, institutional brown, the precise shade of old dried blood or heavily rusted iron. It hung loosely on my skeletal frame, clearly not designed for comfort, but rather for quick and undeniable identification, should any foolish thought of escape ever cross my mind. The fabric was coarse and abrasive against my skin, woven from reclaimed, unknown fibers that still carried the phantom scent of whoever had worn it before me. I made a concerted effort not to ponder their fate, whether they had perished within its scratchy confines, or perhaps simply transcended the very need for clothing altogether. My cell was nothing more than a reinforced rockcrete cube, 3 meters wide, 2 meters deep, and just tall enough for me to stand upright without my head scraping the ceiling, provided I didn't fully straighten my shoulders. The walls perpetually wept condensation, creating dark, spreading stains that eerily resembled abstract maps of forgotten worlds I would never again behold. A narrow slot, positioned near the floor, permitted the guards to slide in my meager daily ration of Nutri paste, while another slot, at eye level, allowed them to observe me with detached, casual leisure. There was no window, no blessed source of natural light, only the harsh, unblinking glare of a single lumen strip that never dimmed, never flickered, and never failed. The sleeping platform was merely a rough shelf of raw, unpolished metal, crudely welded to the wall. No mattress, no pillow, no covering whatsoever save for the thin uniform on my back. The insidious cold seeped through the inadequate fabric within minutes, settling deep into my very bones like a malignant parasite, voraciously feeding on any residual warmth, and more importantly, any lingering hope. I swiftly grasped that sleep in this accursed place was no true rest, but merely another desperate form of survival, a temporary fragile escape from conscious torment that paradoxically left me feeling more utterly exhausted than if I had remained awake. That first night, I lay awake, listening intently to the symphony of penitentia maxima, slowly, painfully learning to breathe around its oppressive sounds. The thick rockcrete walls seemed to carry the fractured voices from distant cells, fragments of fervent prayers, guttural curses, and sudden bursts of mad, echoing laughter that reverberated through the ventilation shafts like the collective whispers of the damned. Someone was screaming 3 levels below, a raw primal sound that went on, eventually merging into the ambient noise, becoming no more remarkable than the low, monotonous hum of the power generators or the furtive skittering of rats within the walls. I meticulously counted the seconds between the guard patrols, committing their predictable rhythm to memory like a sacred, desperate litany. Every 8 minutes and 43 seconds, the heavy, deliberate tread of armored boots would pass my door, pause for precisely 7 seconds as they checked the observation slot, then continue their monotonous journey down the long, shadowed corridor. These guards were not entirely human anymore. Their bodies were crudely augmented with crude bionics, allowing them to endure impossibly long shifts without any need for rest. Their organic eyes had been ripped out and replaced with cold, unfeeling sensors that pierced the deepest darkness, and their voices carried the chilling, mechanical undertones of Voxcaster implants. They seemed to derive a certain pleasure from our misery, but it was a cold, clinical pleasure, surgically precise and chillingly efficient. They harbored no personal hatred for us, for such an emotion would have required them to acknowledge us as individuals, rather than simply as resources to be meticulously managed until our inevitable depletion. We were inventory, nothing more than disposable stock. Inventory, regrettably, with an unfortunate tendency towards spoilage. The morning brought with it the first meal, if indeed the gray, viscous paste that slid through the food slot could be dignified with such a generous name. It tasted simultaneously of nothing and everything, an unsettling, carefully engineered blend of recycled protein and synthetic vitamins, meticulously designed to keep a human body functioning at its absolute minimal capacity for months or even years. I ate it with my bare fingers, as no utensils were ever provided, then meticulously licked the aluminum tray clean, uncertain when, or even if, the next meal would ever arrive. Later, I would discover that the paste contained far more than mere nutrients: mild sedatives to quell aggression, mood stabilizers to preempt suicide attempts, and insidious trace amounts of psychoactive compounds, all calibrated to render the mind more pliable, more susceptible to suggestion and conditioning. The initial weeks of ingesting this daily chemical cocktail left me feeling profoundly disconnected from my own thoughts, as if I were a passive observer, watching someone else's life unfold through a hazy sheet of dirty glass. At first, the other inmates were merely indistinct shadows, glimpsed fleetingly through the narrow gaps in cell doors, or heard as disembodied, whispering voices in the perpetual gloom. The man in the cell immediately to my left had already endured 6 years in this hell. He had been a clerk in the Planetary Defense Force, convicted of the seemingly minor crime of falsifying requisition reports, an act he confessed was solely to procure enough food to feed his starving family during a devastating famine. His name was Marcus, and he spoke almost constantly, an incessant monologue designed to keep the encroaching madness at bay, regaling me with stories of his wife and children, who by now had surely forgotten the very contours of his face. "The trick," he would whisper hoarsely through the thin, separating wall, "is to remember who you were. Cling to something, anything from before. A particular scent, a forgotten song, the way sunlight used to look through your window. The moment you relinquish that, you become precisely what they desire you to become." Across the corridor, a woman screamed in her sleep every single night for my entire first month there. Her dreams, I later gathered, were vivid nightmares of fire and burning children, the searing memories of a planet consumed by flames while she watched, helpless, from an orbital transport. She had been a refugee administrator, charged with corruption because she had dared to divert supplies to save more lives than the official quotas permitted. Her unforgivable crime was compassion, and her horrifying punishment was to endlessly relive the agonizing consequences of that compassion until her own death mercifully claimed her. Labor commenced on my 5th day. They roused us from our restless half-sleep long before dawn, a concept utterly meaningless, in a place where true dawn was merely a ghost from another life. We were then marched through endless, labyrinthine corridors that stretched far beyond the horizon of our comprehension. Penitentia Maxima, I soon realized, was not simply a prison, but a vast, sprawling industrial complex, meticulously engineered around the efficient extraction of raw labor from its utterly disposable human resources. The work was brutally harsh, utterly mindless, and calculated with ruthless precision to break both body and spirit through soul-crushing repetition and the gnawing futility of it all. My specific assignment was the Forge Works, a gargantuan cavern of oppressive heat and choking smoke where we endlessly assembled intricate components for weapons that would be deployed to conquer worlds we would never, ever see. The ambient temperature was meticulously maintained at just below the absolute threshold of what human flesh could endure, hot enough to systematically weaken us, to sap our strength, but never quite hot enough to grant us the swift mercy of death. The air itself was a thick, suffocating slurry of airborne metal particles and chemical vapors that burned the lungs with every ragged breath, leaving a persistent metallic taste on the tongue, like copper pennies. We toiled in teams of 12, our every movement rigorously choreographed by the relentless rhythm of the production line and the ever-present, stinging threat of the shock prods wielded by our supervisors. The components we assembled were deceptively simple things: trigger mechanisms for las rifles, power couplings for vehicle engines, guidance chips for artillery shells. Yet, each piece had to adhere to agonizingly precise specifications, and any failure to maintain these stringent quality standards resulted in immediate, brutal punishment. The punishments themselves were a testament to the guards' cruel creativity. A worker whose hands trembled excessively from exhaustion might find those hands secured in vicious metal braces that forced them to work in increasingly agonizing positions. Someone who dared to fall behind the merciless production pace would be fitted with stimulant injectors, a constant drip of chemicals designed to keep them conscious and barely functional, even as their body began its inevitable shutdown from profound fatigue. The supervisors, with chilling scientific detachment, meticulously took notes on which specific punishments proved most effective at improving productivity, treating us as mere subjects in some grotesque, grand experiment in human endurance. I learned, out of sheer necessity, to lose myself entirely in the work, to consciously allow my mind to drift far away from my tormented body while my hands continued their mechanical, repetitive movements. This profound dissociation became my primary mode of survival, a desperate means of preserving some small, essential core of self, while the prison systematically consumed everything else. But this salvation came at a terrible cost. Days blurred into a continuous, endless, present tense, where past and future became mere abstract concepts, losing all meaning. I began to forget the vibrant color of grass, the gentle sound of falling rain, the fresh, clean feeling of wind that didn't reek of industrial chemicals. The social dynamics within the prison were as intricate as they were vicious. Alliances, fragile and fleeting, formed and dissolved based on the shifting currents of power, desperation, and the ever-present threat of violence. The strongest inmates, typically those with prior military backgrounds or extensive criminal experience, swiftly established themselves as the leaders of informal gangs that controlled the illicit distribution of contraband and the coveted assignment of cell blocks. They demanded tribute, typically in the form of meager food rations, dubious protection services, or even sexual favors, and their enforcement methods were always brutal and immediate. I found myself aligning with a group led by a former sergeant named Kane, a formidable man whose scarred body was a living catalog of wounds from a dozen different battlefields. He had been convicted of abandoning his post during a chaos cult uprising, though he vehemently maintained he had been saving civilians when his commanding officer branded him a coward. Kane understood the profound value of discipline and organization in this chaos, and under his grim protection, I slowly learned the unwritten, brutal rules that govern life in penitentia maxima. Never display weakness, for weakness was blood in the water, and the predators here were always, always hungry. Never volunteer for anything, because volunteers were invariably the first to perish in whatever new horror the guards had ingeniously devised. Never trust anyone completely, for betrayal was sometimes the only currency capable of buying survival. And never, ever give up hope. For hope, even if it was nothing more than the slim possibility of dying quickly instead of slowly, was the last thing that truly separated the living from the walking dead. The guards, in their cunning, actively encouraged conflict among inmates, understanding that fractured, fighting prisoners were far easier to control than any organized resistance. They would deliberately engineer situations where we were forced to compete for scarce resources or paltry privileges, then step back, observing us tear each other apart with the detached scientific interest of researchers studying laboratory animals. I killed my first man on a Tuesday, or at least what I had arbitrarily decided to call Tuesday, in the timeless subterranean hell of our existence. His name was Singh, and he had been a tax collector before his incarceration, arrested for the unforgivable crime of skimming from the imperial tithe. He was a small, wiry man, quick on his feet, possessing the innate cunning of someone who had spent his entire life finding ingenious ways to pilfer what rightfully belonged to others. For weeks, he had been subtly stealing from my food rations, taking just enough to ensure I felt a constant, gnawing hunger, but not so much that I would immediately detect the theft. When I finally cornered him, he merely laughed, a high, mocking sound, and told me I was far too weak to do anything about it. He was profoundly wrong. The beating I delivered was not born of passionate anger, but was cold, methodical, and meticulously calculated to inflict maximum damage while shrewdly avoiding the attention of the ever-watchful guards. I utilized techniques I had subtly observed from other inmates settling their disputes, targeting joints and soft tissues where the visible evidence of violence would be minimized. When he finally stopped moving, I felt absolutely nothing, save for a mild, almost clinical satisfaction that the problem had been efficiently resolved. The guards discovered his lifeless body during the next cell inspection. They dutifully recorded his death as natural causes, heart failure brought on by poor nutrition and severe stress. No one, of course, dared to question this diagnosis, for questioning would have entailed endless paperwork and pointless investigations that served absolutely no useful purpose in their efficient system. Singh simply vanished from the prisoner manifest as if he had never existed, and his cell was reassigned to another unfortunate soul within hours. That night, Kane gave me a slow, deliberate nod, an expression on his scarred face that might have been approval. "You're learning," he grunted, his voice a low rasp. "The first kill is always the hardest. After that, it's just another skill. Like welding or reading or any other thing you need to know to get by in this place." He was right, disturbingly so. The second death came with more ease, and the third easier still. By the end of my first year in Penitentia Maxima, I had completely stopped counting the bodies. Violence had become just another mundane aspect of daily routine, no more remarkable than eating, sleeping, or working the relentless production lines. The capacity for horror, which had once defined the very limits of my imagination, had expanded grotesquely to accommodate realities I could never have conceived in my previous life. But the overt physical violence was merely the most visible manifestation of how the prison insidiously consumed us. The true destruction unfolded slowly, invisibly, in the gradual, agonizing erosion of everything that made us fundamentally human. They fed us just enough to maintain minimal functionality, but never enough to truly feel satisfied. They allowed us just enough sleep to prevent total physiological collapse, but never enough to feel genuinely rested. They grudgingly provided just enough medical care to avert rampant epidemics, but never enough to alleviate our constant, pervasive suffering. The psychological warfare, I realized, was far more sophisticated, far more insidious. They would occasionally announce that certain prisoners were being considered for early release, a cruel deception that ignited desperate, brutal competitions among inmates, each striving to prove their rehabilitation through increased productivity or zealous, voluntary cooperation with the guards. These announcements were, without exception, always malicious lies. No one ever truly left Penitentia Maxima, save in body bags or as the raw components for the servitor conversion programs. The servitor program, in its chilling reality, was perhaps the cruelest deception of all. Prisoners who volunteered for conversion were promised that their consciousness, their very essence, would somehow be preserved, that they would continue to exist as valuable, loyal servants of the Imperium, rather than simply dying as forgotten criminals. The stark, horrific reality was a brutal lobotomization, swiftly followed by extensive cybernetic implantation, a process that left behind only the barest flicker of brain function, just enough to operate simple machinery and obey basic commands. The very servitors who diligently maintained the prison had once been inmates like us, their humanity surgically excised, brutally replaced with mechanical obedience. I watched helpless as friends, one by one, disappeared into the conversion chambers, genuinely convinced they were choosing a form of survival over an ignominious death. Marcus, the clerk who had once offered me his grim rules of survival, voluntarily joined the program after receiving news that his family had tragically been declared dead in a mining accident. He simply could not bear the thought of continuing to exist in a world where his suffering served absolutely no purpose, and the chilling promise of mechanical peace seemed infinitely preferable to conscious despair. The last time I saw him, he was silently sweeping the corridor outside my cell, his movements precise, repetitive, utterly devoid of natural grace. His eyes, once full of weary humanity, had been replaced with cold, unblinking optical sensors, and his skull bore the telltale surgical scars where his personality, his very soul, had been ruthlessly carved away. I called his name, my voice a desperate whisper, but he did not respond. Marcus was gone, irrevocably replaced by a thing that wore his familiar face and carried his faint memories, yet lacked any trace of his former soul. The seasons shifted above us, though we perceived them only through the subtle, oppressive variations in temperature and humidity that filtered down through the labyrinthine ventilation systems. Summer brought a stifling, suffocating heat that rendered the already unbearable work conditions nearly lethal. Winter, conversely, brought an insidious chill that seeped relentlessly through the rockcrete, settling deep into our bones, making every movement an agony and every breath visible in the frigid, stale air. Years passed, or what felt like an eternity of years. Time itself became a malleable, elastic concept in the eternal twilight of the prison, stretching and compressing according to the relentless rhythms of pain and fleeting, temporary relief that structured our bleak existence. I lost all track of my own age, forgetting whether I was 30 or 50 or somewhere in the desolate interim. My hair, once dark, went gray, then prematurely white, then began to fall out in unhealthy clumps from the chronic chemical exposure in the factories. My teeth loosened, several eventually falling out, leaving unsightly gaps that made eating more difficult and speaking a labored, painful effort. The woman who had screamed in her sleep finally died during my third winter. I distinctly heard her final breath through the thin wall between our cells, a rattling, protracted exhalation that seemed to go on forever before at last, mercifully, stopping. The guards, in their callous indifference, did not bother to remove her body for 2 long days, and the sickening stench of decay filled our entire block with a sickly, cloying odor that clung tenaciously to everything and everyone. When they finally came for her, they were not gentle. I heard the sickening sound of her remains being dragged unceremoniously down the corridor, a sound like wet cloth being pulled across rough, unforgiving stone. New prisoners arrived constantly, a never-ending influx, relentlessly taking the places of those who had died or been converted or simply vanished into the administrative maze that effortlessly swallowed inconvenient people. They arrived with the same wide-eyed terror I had once known, asking the same naive questions about justice, about appeals, about making contact with the outside world. The older inmates would gaze upon them with expressions of distant, weary pity, knowing with grim certainty that these newcomers would either adapt to the brutal reality or perish, but that they would never again be the people they had been before, walking through those unforgiving iron doors. I attempted to help some of them, sharing the hard-won knowledge I had accumulated about survival and the unwritten, brutal rules that governed our existence. Most listened politely, then promptly ignored my advice, convinced that their situation was merely temporary or that their inherent innocence would somehow miraculously protect them from the relentless, grinding machinery of institutional cruelty. A precious few learned quickly enough to survive their first grueling year. Many, many did not. The gladiatorial combats, though officially termed disciplinary exhibitions in the guards' meticulously kept reports, began during my 4th year. Prisoners who violated rules or failed to meet their production quotas were selected, often at random, to fight each other in a makeshift arena hastily constructed in one of the larger, rarely used storage chambers. Officially, these fights were not intended to be to the death, but serious, debilitating injuries were commonplace, and medical treatment was, at best, minimal. The guards and administrators would watch from elevated platforms, their faces lit with a depraved excitement, placing bets on the outcomes and discussing the fighters' techniques with the detached professionalism of livestock breeders. I found myself selected for the arena after a moment of uncontrollable rage led me to strike a guard who had been relentlessly taunting a dying man in the cell adjacent to mine. The guard had been describing in graphic, sickening detail how the man's family had been sold into indentured servitude to pay his outstanding debts, savoring each wheeze and sob his cruel words provoked. When I finally ordered him to stop, he simply turned his attention to me, speculating with a leering grin about what unspeakable services my body might be forced to provide once I was too weak to labor on the production lines. The blow I struck was purely instinctive, a visceral surge of rage that had been slowly building for years, a torrent of fury that had, until that moment, never found an appropriate target. My fist connected squarely with his throat, crushing his larynx and sending him gasping to his knees, desperately clawing for air that would not come. He did not die, but he would never speak normally again, and the mechanical rasp that replaced his voice became a constant grating reminder of what defiant will could accomplish when properly applied. My opponent in the arena was a massive man named Voss, a former pit fighter who had been imprisoned for killing a planetary governor's son in an unsanctioned bout. He was everything I was not: young, impossibly strong, seasoned in violence, and utterly devoid of fear or hesitation. The crowd of guards and administrators roared their approval as he strode into the arena, their voices echoing off the concrete walls like the rabid howling of hungry animals. The weapons provided were crude but brutally effective: lengths of sharpened rebar, heavy weighted chains, and jagged broken bottles wrapped in cloth for a better grip. I chose a piece of pipe, its weight substantial enough to crush bone, but not so cumbersome that it would impede my movements. Voss, with the professional assessment of someone who had spent years mastering the efficient infliction of pain, selected a heavy chain, testing its balance with a practiced swing. The fight itself lasted 17 excruciating minutes, though it felt like an eternity of hours. Voss was undeniably stronger and faster, but I possessed advantages he could not have anticipated: sheer desperation, cunning born of survival, and the accumulated, simmering rage of years spent watching good people systematically destroyed by a callous system that ravenously fed on suffering. I deftly evaded his direct, powerful attacks, skillfully utilizing the arena's confined dimensions to maintain my mobility, always searching for openings created by his overconfidence and aggressive abandon. When that opening finally presented itself, I seized it without a millisecond of hesitation. He overextended during a particularly vicious swing, and I stepped swiftly inside his guard, driving the pipe into his solar plexus with enough savage force to rupture internal organs. He doubled over from the impact, his breath coming in short, choked gasps that sprayed blood onto the arena floor. I hit him again, this time across the base of his skull, and he fell forward into his own spreading blood, twitching once, convulsively, before finally becoming still. The crowd roared their approval at my victory, but their applause felt less like celebration and more like a damning condemnation. I had become precisely what they had always intended for me to become: a cold, efficient killer who performed acts of violence for their depraved entertainment. A broken, hollowed-out thing that had long forgotten the fundamental difference between true survival and utter, abject surrender. The guards returned me to my cell with expressions of profound satisfaction, as if I had somehow passed a crucial test, unequivocally proving that their cruel methods were working exactly as intended. The victories that followed were, technically, easier to achieve, but emotionally they became infinitely more difficult. Each opponent was just another prisoner, another soul like myself, someone who had been shaped by the same oppressive forces and driven to the same desperate measures. I dispatched them with brutal efficiency, devoid of passion or hatred, because efficiency was what the situation ruthlessly demanded, and because caring too much about the lives I extinguished would have made my own survival utterly impossible. Between the fights, the soul-crushing labor, and the ever-present threat of betrayal, between the brutal arena fights, I toiled on the noisy production lines, constantly wrestling with my fractured memories, striving to recall the person I once was before this life as a gladiator consumed me. Those precious recollections, however, were steadily blurring, dissolving into abstract, nebulous fragments, much like tales one hears of strangers, detached and unreal. Could it be true that I had once been a teacher, standing confidently before classrooms filled with bright-eyed children, who regarded me with such innocent respect and genuine affection? Did I truly inhabit a modest home, graced by a vibrant garden where I cultivated vegetables and flowers? Not out of necessity, but simply for the profound beauty I found in nurturing life. The intricate details of my past intermingled and fused, making it impossible to discern the boundaries between genuine memory and mere fantasy. Perhaps the grim truth was that I had never been anything but my current self. A mere prisoner, a hardened killer, an object whose sole purpose was to stand as a stark, living example of the cruel fate awaiting those who dared defy the Imperium's iron will. My entire former life might have been nothing more than a carefully constructed delusion, a comforting falsehood woven by my own mind to render this unbearable present marginally tolerable. Cain passed away during my 5th year of incarceration, not by the swift violence of the arena, but slowly, inexorably, succumbing to a virulent cancer that had silently consumed his lungs for many months. The pervasive, noxious chemicals in the prison's atmosphere had, at last, accumulated to lethal concentrations, overwhelming his body's ability to withstand the continuous assault of poison. He confronted his impending demise with the same unwavering pragmatism he applied to every aspect of his existence, offering me invaluable counsel on leadership and the grim art of survival, until his voice, now a mere whisper, could no longer bridge the distance across our cell. Don't ever let them transform you into something you despise, something you can't live with, he implored me during our final solemn conversation. I've witnessed truly good men degenerate into monsters within these walls. And, paradoxically, I've seen actual monsters discover fragments of their humanity. The profound choice, my friend, is always yours, even when the oppressive reality makes it feel as if no choice remains. His passing created a palpable void within the intricate power structure of the prison, a void that other ambitious inmates immediately rushed to exploit and fill. The ensuing struggles for dominance were predictably brutal and swift, decided by ruthless assassination and treacherous betrayals, rather than any semblance of a democratic process. I meticulously avoided any involvement in these perilous power plays, having long since grasped the harsh truth. Visibility was a dangerous commodity. The most secure position, I understood, often lay in the middle tiers of the hierarchy, where one was deemed valuable enough to warrant protection, yet not so important as to pose a direct threat. The new formidable leader was a woman named Catherine, a former naval officer whose distinguished career had ended with a conviction for mutiny, a consequence of her steadfast refusal to carry out orders to bombard a civilian population center. She possessed a formidable intellect, a chilling ruthlessness, and an absolute, unyielding commitment to her own survival, no matter the price. Under her steely leadership, the inmate organization transformed, becoming more frighteningly efficient, yet simultaneously more brutal, enforcing harsh punishments for even the slightest hint of perceived disloyalty or weakness. She sought me out following one of my arena triumphs, her gaze piercing, her eyes reflecting a profound weariness from witnessing too much cruelty, having seemingly forgotten the very concept of mercy. "You fight exceptionally well," she stated, her voice devoid of emotion. "However, you fight with the lingering delusion that you might one day depart this place. That very hope, I assure you, will inevitably be your undoing." And despite my reluctance to acknowledge it then, she spoke an undeniable truth. A stubborn, resilient part of my being still clung desperately to the faint glimmer of escape, the improbable dream of release, or even the impossible promise of redemption. This tenacious hope, I realized, was rendering me dangerously complacent. The truly formidable prisoners were those who had entirely embraced their grim destiny, abandoning all contemplation of a future beyond these walls, dedicating themselves solely to the stark, immediate demands of survival. The inevitable escape attempt materialized during my 6th year, meticulously orchestrated by a contingent of political prisoners who had remarkably managed to corrupt several guards and obtain highly detailed blueprints of the facility's intricate layout. They extended an invitation for me to join their audacious endeavor, clearly discerning my formidable combat prowess and comparatively robust physical condition as invaluable assets that could significantly bolster their odds of success. The intricate plan was undoubtedly complex, yet it possessed a plausible chance of success. Generate a massive distraction during a critical shift change, swiftly overwhelm the guards stationed at a secondary checkpoint, and then exploit the labyrinthine maintenance tunnels to reach the surface world before any alarms could be effectively raised. I consented to participate, even though a deep, cynical part of me already knew the attempt was fundamentally doomed, not due to any inherent flaw in the plan itself, but because true escape was never truly about merely departing the physical confines of the prison. The authentic prison was, in fact, the twisted beings we had evolved into during our endless years of incarceration. The irreparable, accumulated damage to our minds and souls that could not be shed simply by traversing a different doorway. In essence, we were planning to carry our very selves, with all their psychological baggage, with us wherever we fled. The escape attempt failed precisely as my weary cynicism had predicted, though the specific reasons for its collapse were entirely different from what I had anticipated. The guards, it turned out, had possessed full knowledge of our meticulously planned escape from its very inception, having been clandestinely informed by one of our own conspirators, who had been promised preferential treatment in exchange for his cooperation. This informant was a frail man named Peter, a former accountant, who had been slowly withering away from chronic malnutrition, and saw this as his only chance to improve his desperate odds of surviving long enough to simply witness another winter. The guards allowed our desperate bid for freedom to unfold, permitting us to commit ourselves fully to the plan, only to then activate blaring alarms and seal off the very maintenance tunnels we were utilizing as our escape route. The subsequent pursuit was not frantic or desperate, but rather chillingly methodical, akin to professional exterminators systematically flushing out vermin that had burrowed deep within the walls. They deployed noxious gas to flush us from our makeshift hiding spots, utilized brutal shock prods to incapacitate anyone foolhardy enough to resist, and dispensed casual, gratuitous violence as a stark deterrent against any future escape attempts. Of the 12 desperate prisoners who had dared to participate in the doomed attempt, 4 were summarily executed on the spot. 3 others were chillingly selected for servitor conversion, a fate arguably worse than death, while the remaining 5, myself included, were returned to the general population, now burdened with significantly enhanced restrictions and relentless monitoring. I found myself among those who survived, yet I harbored no certainty as to whether this amounted to good fortune or, indeed, a more protracted form of suffering. These newly imposed severe restrictions condemned me to months of agonizing solitary confinement, drastically reduced food rations, and the complete removal from any work assignments that might, however remotely, present future opportunities for escape planning. Solitary confinement, I quickly discovered, was a distinct species of death, a far slower, yet undeniably more pervasive and thorough annihilation than the swift, brutal violence of the arena. The solitary cell was a suffocating, claustrophobic box, even smaller than my previous meager accommodations, barely affording me enough space to lie down fully with my arms outstretched. No light penetrated the absolute gloom, save for a faint, teasing sliver that seeped beneath the door. Human contact was entirely absent, apart from the impersonal, silent delivery of my daily, meager food ration. The only sounds were the hollow rhythm of my own breathing, the thumping of my heart, and the chilling internal murmur of my sanity slowly, irrevocably unraveling. I found myself engaged in ceaseless, desperate self-talk, fabricating conversations with figures from my distant past, individuals who now existed solely as increasingly fragmented and unreliable memories. I narrated stories to the unyielding walls, recited fragments of poetry dimly recalled from my school days, and hummed the eroded melodies of songs, their words long since stripped away by the relentless tide of time and stress. The fragile boundary separating my internal dialogue from external speech utterly dissolved, and I began to respond to spectral voices that existed purely within my mind, conversing with them as if they were tangible beings seated beside me in the suffocating darkness. The insidious hallucinations commenced after the third month, unsettling visual distortions that would coalesce into recognizable faces when my gaze was not directly upon them, fleeting movements in my peripheral vision hinting at phantom presences, and shadows that seemed to possess impossible depth and substance, even within the profound, oppressive darkness of the cell. I intellectually understood that these terrifying perceptions were not real, yet this knowledge offered no solace, rendering them no less vivid or profoundly disturbing. When at last they returned me to the general population, I emerged into a prison transformed in ways that transcended mere attrition and routine replacement. Harsh new policies had been brutally implemented, innovative and cruel punishments had been devised, and insidious new forms of degradation were routinely introduced, often purely for the perverse entertainment of the guards and administrators. The brutal gladiatorial combats themselves had been formalized and expanded into a full-fledged tournament system, complete with intricate brackets, coveted championships, and illicit betting pools that attracted personnel from across the entire correctional system. The already abysmal food rations had further deteriorated, work assignments had become even more perilous, and medical care was now reduced to a mere perfunctory gesture. Prisoners were dying at an alarmingly accelerated rate, their ravaged bodies utterly incapable of coping with the intensified demands and drastically diminished support. The administration, it seemed, had coldly concluded that maintaining the facility was becoming excessively costly and had decided to resolve this budgetary problem by systematically working the inmates to their deaths as swiftly and efficiently as possible. Remarkably, I had been singled out and selected as a featured competitor in this new championship tournament, my dark reputation as an unyielding arena fighter having ironically solidified and grown during my prolonged absence in solitary. My fellow prisoners regarded me with a complex blend of expressions I struggled to decipher: fear, grudging respect, bitter envy, and something else, a hint of profound pity. They understood, as I was now painfully beginning to grasp that excelling at violence within these walls was far from an advantage. It was, in fact, a devastating curse, destined to ultimately devour every last vestige of the person I might once have been. The tournament itself was meticulously structured as a ruthless series of elimination bouts, where the victorious combatants advanced to confront progressively more formidable and lethal opponents, until only a single bloodied fighter remained standing. The purported prizes for victory were utterly meaningless. A few extra food rations, marginally improved cell assignments, and the hollow promise of reduced sentences, a promise every prisoner knew with cold certainty would never, ever be honored. The true sinister purpose was pure entertainment, a macabre gladiatorial spectacle designed to allow the guards to wager on predetermined outcomes, all while watching helpless prisoners brutally destroy each other for their sadistic amusement. My initial opponent was a boy man named David, barely 20 years of age, convicted of draft evasion during a critical planetary defense mobilization. He had been incarcerated for less than a year, and his still soft body bore the lingering marks of the life he had enjoyed before his sudden arrest. He moved with the awkward, untrained desperation of someone who had never truly learned to fight, relying solely on raw adrenaline and a primal will to survive, rather than any semblance of technique or experience. I dispatched him swiftly, efficiently, and with a chilling absence of pleasure or remorse. The assembled crowd erupted in savage cheers, yet their voices registered as distant and utterly unimportant to me, like muffled background noise emanating from an entirely separate room. I had irrevocably crossed some invisible, terrifying line during my harrowing months in solitary confinement. The very emotional responses that had once rendered violence a difficult act were now utterly inaccessible to me. I felt absolutely nothing as he died, save for a detached, mild satisfaction that a logistical problem had been efficiently resolved. The subsequent matches unfolded in a chillingly identical pattern. Opponent after opponent, each one desperate and visibly terrified, yet ultimately inadequate for the brutal task of survival. I dispatched them with an ever-increasing, almost mechanical precision, my movements streamlining and becoming ruthlessly efficient as I systematically eliminated anything extraneous, anything not absolutely essential to securing victory. The crowd swelled, growing larger and more frenetically enthusiastic as news of the tournament's relentless progress disseminated throughout the entire facility. The climactic final match was slated against Catherine, the former naval officer who had usurped Kane's position as the formidable leader of the inmate organization. She was older, undeniably more experienced, and utterly ruthless in her strategic approach to both leadership and hand-to-hand combat. Crucially, she had nothing left to lose, having long since relinquished any faint glimmer of hope for survival or redemption, choosing instead the grim solace of simple, unyielding endurance. "One of us will walk away from this fight," she observed dispassionately as we prepared for the brutal confrontation. "The other will become mere fertilizer for whatever meager weeds manage to sprout in the prison graveyard. But either way, the truth is, we are both already dead. We perished the very day we crossed through those unforgiving doors. Everything since then has simply been our bodies, stubbornly, belatedly, catching up to that inescapable reality." She was undeniably correct. And that stark, chilling realization paradoxically liberated me from the last fragile constraints of conscience, and the fading echoes of my humanity. I fought her with the totality of everything I had painstakingly learned during my soul-crushing years in Penitentia Maxima, employing every brutal technique of violence and cunning deception that had allowed me to survive when so many demonstrably better people had tragically perished. The match itself stretched on, lasting longer than any of the preceding bouts. Both of us were far too experienced, too utterly hardened, to commit the obvious, fatal mistakes that would have brought the fight to a swift conclusion. When I finally delivered the killing blow, it was achieved not through sheer superior skill, but through calculated treachery. I expertly feigned a debilitating injury, a deceptive maneuver that momentarily caused her to drop her guard, allowing me just enough time to maneuver myself into position for a decisive, lethal strike. The blow landed squarely on her temple, brutally crushing the bone and driving fragments deep into her brain. She collapsed soundlessly, her face devoid of any surprise or accusation, bearing only the distant, resigned expression of someone who had been patiently anticipating this very moment for an exceedingly long time. The bloodthirsty crowd erupted in a frenzy of celebration, their savage cheers echoing grotesquely off the unyielding concrete walls, sounding eerily like the collective screaming of the damned. I stood impassively over Catherine's lifeless body, slick with her blood and my own, feeling absolutely nothing. No triumph, no regret. The gruesome tournament was concluded. The championship was undeniably mine. Yet, none of it truly mattered, for we were all fundamentally already dead, and had been so from the very moment we entered this infernal place. They returned me to my desolate cell that very night, showering me with hollow promises of lavish rewards and dramatically improved conditions. Promises I knew, with absolute certainty, were nothing more than elaborate lies. The gruesome tournament had served its insidious purpose perfectly. It had provided brutal entertainment for the jaded guards, and, more importantly, had served as a terrifying demonstration to the other inmates of the grim fate awaiting those who became too adept, too dangerous at the art of violence. I understood my fate. I would continue to fight whenever summoned, continue to kill whomever they placed before me, until the inevitable day when I became too old or too irreparably damaged to be of further use, at which point I would be quietly, efficiently disposed of. The subsequent years dissolved into a monotonous, indistinguishable blur of routine violence and soul-crushing despair. I fought mechanically in the arena when summoned, toiled mindlessly on the production lines when assigned, and merely existed in the suffocating confines of my cell during the desolate hours between these grim obligations. The other prisoners now actively avoided me, having recognized that I had transformed into something fundamentally different from my former self, something undeniably more dangerous, yet simultaneously far more profoundly broken. New inmates ceaselessly streamed into the facility, filling the vacant places left by those who had perished or been terrifyingly converted, or had simply vanished into the vast, indifferent, administrative machinery that processed human suffering with chilling, industrial efficiency. I observed them undergo the very same agonizing stages of adaptation or ultimate destruction that I myself had endured. Yet I felt no discernible connection to their struggles, offering neither assistance nor counsel. Their survival or eventual death was entirely irrelevant to me, for the very concept of survival had, by then, become utterly meaningless. The rare dreams that occasionally visited me were no longer of freedom, or sweet revenge, or even the faint hope of justice, but rather of a blissful, absolute non-existence. I yearned in my sleep to dissolve utterly into the cold, unyielding walls of my cell, to become an indistinguishable part of the very stone and metal that confined us all. I dreamed of forgetting my own name, shedding my entire history, and erasing my own face from whatever warped mirror might still yield reflections in this desolate place. I crave the profound peace that descends only when consciousness itself finally ceases, and the crushing burden of selfhood is at last lifted from shoulders that have carried it for far too long. Yet, consciousness stubbornly, defiantly persisted, an unwelcome affliction, relentlessly dragging me through each indistinguishable day and into each bleak night with a torturous, mechanical regularity. My ravaged body continued its grim function, miraculously enduring despite the accumulated damage from years of chronic poor nutrition, relentless chemical exposure, and frequent brutal violence. My mind, too, stubbornly continued to process sensory input and meticulously form memories, even though the experiences being recorded were so chillingly similar to countless previous ones that they hardly seemed worth the effort of remembering. I now measured the relentless passage of time, not in conventional days or months, but in the grim tally of deaths. The deaths of defeated opponents in the arena, the deaths of cellmates succumbing to disease or violence or simple, profound exhaustion. And, most disturbingly, the deaths of countless parts of myself that had once felt utterly essential, but had proven terrifyingly expendable when the harsh calculus of survival demanded it. Each death served as a stark, indelible mark on an invisible calendar, charting my horrifying journey from a recognizable human being to something else entirely, something that still bore a human shape, but had utterly forgotten its human purpose. The facility administrators, those architects of suffering, occasionally deigned to visit my cell, scrutinizing me with the detached, clinical interest of scientists meticulously observing a particularly successful, albeit horrifying, experiment. They posed probing questions about my experiences, my chilling observations regarding the prison's deteriorating conditions, and even solicited my recommendations for ostensibly improving the efficiency of their correctional process. I answered them with brutal honesty, not out of any moral conviction, but simply because honesty demanded less effort than weaving elaborate deceptions. Furthermore, in this desolate place, the very distinction between truth and lies had long since dissolved, rendering neither of any consequence. "You have been adapted remarkably well," one of them remarked, during a particularly protracted interview, his tone chillingly analytical. "Most prisoners either break completely, descending into madness, or they maintain just enough resistance to remain problematic. You, however, have discovered the optimal, delicate balance between total compliance and continued functionality." I inquired what he meant by that, though a cold dread told me I already knew the devastating answer. "It means you have become precisely what this meticulously designed system was intended to produce," he elaborated, a chilling satisfaction in his voice. "A human being who has been systematically stripped of every last vestige that might enable resistance, while still retaining enough cognitive capacity to perform useful functions. You are, in essence, a flawless template for the future of Imperial corrections." He was undeniably proud of their monstrous accomplishment, proud of the profound and irreversible transformation they had meticulously wrought upon both my ravaged flesh and my shattered soul. I was their ultimate masterpiece, living proof that any human consciousness, no matter how resilient, could be systematically broken down and then chillingly rebuilt to conform entirely to institutional needs. The man I had once been, before the day of my arrest, was utterly annihilated, replaced by a hollow shell that bore his semblance, yet shared none of his fundamental characteristics or spirit. That night, as I lay upon my cold, metal sleeping platform, I futilely attempted to conjure an image of what I had looked like before I was condemned to this existence as a prisoner. The face that flickered in my memory was frustratingly generic, unremarkable, and perhaps even entirely imaginary. I could not, for the life of me, recall the color of my own eyes, the precise shape of my nose, or even the subtle nuances of how my mouth once curved when I genuinely smiled. The person who had once inhabited that forgotten face was now a complete stranger to me, an enigma whose motivations and desires were as alien and incomprehensible as those of an entirely different species. The final crushing revelation descended upon me during what I believe was my 10th year within the torturous confines of Penitentia Maxima, though the precise timing had by then become largely meaningless, as time itself had long since lost most of its conventional significance. A new administrator arrived, brimming with a naive, fresh enthusiasm, assuming command of the facility. She was a young woman whose idealistic demeanor suggested she had not yet been fully indoctrinated to perceive prisoners as anything other than fellow human beings who had simply erred. She swiftly instituted a series of sweeping reforms: better food rations, significantly improved medical care, and even comprehensive educational programs explicitly designed to prepare inmates for their eventual hopeful release. These changes, though perhaps modest in the grand scheme, were undeniably noticeable, and for the first time in countless years, I felt a faint, almost forgotten stirring, something that might, just might, have been hope, deep within the ravaged depths of my consciousness. Perhaps, I allowed myself to ponder, redemption was indeed possible after all. Perhaps the person I had been before my arrest was not utterly dead, but merely deeply dormant, patiently awaiting the precise conditions to reemerge from whatever shadowed corner of my mind still faintly remembered how to be truly human. The new administrator, Elena Vasquez, a beacon of unexpected idealism, initiated a series of individual meetings with long-term prisoners, meticulously seeking to assess their potential for rehabilitation. When my designated turn arrived, I found myself seated across from her in a small, almost incongruously normal office, tastefully adorned with vibrant plants and serene pictures depicting worlds where warm sunlight still graced lush, green, growing things. The sheer normalcy of the setting was profoundly disorienting after endless years spent amidst sterile concrete and cold metal. I found it incredibly challenging to focus on her earnest questions, my gaze repeatedly drawn to a photograph on her desk, an image of joyous children playing freely in a sun-dappled park, a world unimaginably distant from this place. "You've been incarcerated here longer than almost anyone else," she observed, her voice tinged with a delicate concern as she consulted a thick file containing the exhaustive documentation of my decade in captivity. 10 years, 4 months, 17 days, to be precise. That represents an unusually protracted length of service for someone with your initial classification. Service, She chose that word, service, as if my protracted imprisonment had been a form of employment, a voluntary contribution, rather than a brutal, soul-destroying punishment. I silently wondered if she genuinely held such a belief, or if she was merely employing carefully chosen language to render her grim duties more palatable to her own conscience. "What precisely would you like to do if you were to be released?" she asked, her voice resonating with a sincerity that felt startlingly genuine, yet paradoxically profoundly dangerous. Hope, I knew, was an extravagant luxury I could no longer afford, a profound weakness that would only render my already precarious survival even more arduous should her well-intentioned reforms prove fleeting. I relayed the stark, unvarnished truth. I could not recall desiring anything beyond the most rudimentary requirements for mere continued existence: food, a modicum of shelter, and the fleeting absence of immediate pain or overt threat. The dreams and fervent ambitions that had once so powerfully animated my actions were now as utterly foreign to me as the inscrutable desires of an alien species. She meticulously made notes in my file, her expression a careful mask of concern that could have been either professionally detached or genuinely personal. "The human capacity for adaptation is truly remarkable," she mused, her voice gentle, "but it is rarely irreversible. With proper, sustained support and careful, gradual reintegration, even profound psychological damage can often be effectively addressed." I longed to tell her, to disabuse her of her naive optimism, to explain that some transformations, once brutally completed, were utterly irreversible. The man she earnestly sought to rehabilitate no longer truly existed, save as a fragmented collection of faded memories and instinctual reflexes, all grimly repurposed to serve the bare, brutal needs of survival. But I remained silent, for her fragile hope was clearly precious to her, and its destruction would have served no useful purpose in this desolate place. Desolate. The educational programs she meticulously implemented were entirely voluntary, staffed by prisoner volunteers who, against all odds, had managed to retain enough of their former knowledge to capably serve as instructors. I found myself attending classes in basic literacy and arithmetic, not because I genuinely required these skills, but because the very routine of learning provided a much-needed structure that rendered the crushing passage of time marginally more bearable. My fellow students were predominantly younger prisoners, newly arrived, whose idealism had not yet been entirely crushed, and who still clung to the naive belief in the possibility of eventual release. The instructor for my literacy class was a former librarian named Samuel, a gaunt man with remarkably gentle eyes, whose crime had been the grave offense of possessing banned books. He taught with an almost saintly quiet patience, never betraying a hint of frustration when his students grappled with concepts that, in a previous life, had once been effortlessly simple for them. His sole crime had been an insatiable curiosity, an unyielding desire to read and comprehend texts that the oppressive authorities had arbitrarily deemed perilous to the established public order. Reading, he confided to us during one memorable lesson, his voice a frail whisper, is truly remembering how to be human. Every single word you comprehend, every phrase you grasp, is a precious piece of yourself that this brutal system hasn't yet managed to utterly destroy. He was brutally murdered a mere 3 weeks later during a savage brawl in the chaotic dining hall, struck viciously in the head with a metal tray by another inmate who coveted his meager extra food ration. The educational programs, surprisingly, continued under the guidance of new, less inspired instructors. But with Samuel's tragic death, something irrevocably essential had been extinguished. The replacement teachers, competent but uninspired, merely taught the dry mechanics of literacy, utterly failing to grasp its profound, deeper significance. They inadvertently transformed education into just another tedious form of forced labor, rather than the redemptive pathway back to humanity it had briefly promised to be. Administrator Vasquez's tenure proved fleeting, lasting only 8 months before she was predictably reassigned to duties that were deemed better suited to her compassionate temperament and limited experience within such a cruel system. The official explanation provided was the ubiquitous claim of budgetary constraints, necessitating a more efficient management approach. But every soul within these walls understood the stark, true explanation. Compassion was an exorbitant luxury, and the Imperium possessed vanishingly few resources to squander on the futile rehabilitation of individuals who would, in its cold calculus, never again prove to be useful citizens. Her chilling replacement was Colonel Marcus Thorne, a formidable former military police officer who had forged his grim reputation through his brutal management of prisoner of war camps during the infamous Third Tarsus campaign. He arrived with an unequivocal mandate: drastically reduce operational costs while grimly maintaining or even increasing productivity levels. His methods, predictably, reflected the unvarnished brutality of a man who viewed prisoners not as citizens who had merely erred, but as captured enemy combatants fit only for ruthless exploitation. The fragile reforms, so painstakingly instituted by Administrator Vasquez, were systematically and ruthlessly reversed within mere days of Thorne's iron-fisted arrival. Food rations plummeted back to their agonizing subsistence levels. Medical care was now confined to purely emergency cases, a perfunctory nod to basic survival, and the nascent educational programs were entirely eradicated, replaced by grueling, expanded work shifts. The brutal gladiatorial tournaments were not only reinstated, but dramatically expanded, with increased frequency and more elaborate, tantalizing prize structures explicitly designed to maximize prisoner participation and fuel their desperate hopes. "Rehabilitation is a luxury we simply cannot afford," Thorne declared, his voice a cold, unyielding monotone, during his very first chilling address to the assembled prisoner population. "Your sole purpose here is not to become better people, but to serve the Imperium through relentless, productive labor until your designated sentences are fulfilled, or, more likely, until your usefulness utterly expires. Those among you who embrace this immutable reality will find their remaining time within these walls considerably more tolerable than those who stubbornly cling to unrealistic, foolish expectations." The reversion to the old, brutal system was swift and utterly comprehensive, but a fundamental shift had occurred during that brief period of reform, one that proved impossible to entirely eradicate. Certain prisoners had rekindled the memory of what it meant to be treated as human beings, not mere resources. This potent memory ignited a form of resistance far more insidious and dangerous than any overt physical rebellion. They quietly began to organize, exchanging vital information and scarce resources in clandestine ways that hinted at the potential for coordinated, strategic action. I found myself approached by various clandestine groups, each attempting to recruit me into their disparate schemes. Some focused on audacious escape plans, while others aimed for more disruptive acts of sabotage or overt protest. My established reputation as a brutal arena fighter made me a valuable asset to any faction contemplating violent resistance. Concurrently, my protracted incarceration had afforded me a deep, intimate understanding of the prison's intricate operations, insights that could prove invaluable for more subtle, strategic forms of opposition. I politely but firmly declined every invitation, acutely aware that any organized resistance, however well-intentioned, would merely furnish the administration with further pretexts for implementing even harsher, more repressive measures. The inevitable crackdown commenced a mere 3 months after Thorne's arrival, precipitated by the discovery of an illicit smuggling network that had efficiently moved contraband between the various cell blocks. The subsequent investigation proved both thorough and exceptionally brutal, employing relentless interrogations, intrusive searches, and severe punishments meticulously designed not only to extract immediate information, but also to effectively deter any future conspiracies. Inmates were systematically pitted against one another through insidious promises of improved conditions or stark threats of intensified punishment. This cultivated and pervasive atmosphere of deep suspicion and profound betrayal, rendering any form of genuine cooperation exceedingly perilous. I was interrogated repeatedly and relentlessly about my alleged knowledge of resistance activities, the nature of my relationships with other prisoners, and my potential willingness to serve as an informant in exchange for more favorable conditions. These interrogations were expertly conducted by specialist personnel, individuals who possessed a chillingly precise understanding of the psychology of long-term prisoners and intuitively knew which specific pressures would be most effective at eroding whatever fragile remnants of our collective solidarity still persisted. "You're a survivor," the lead interrogator stated dispassionately during what would be our final session. "You've endured for 10 long years by skillfully adapting to constantly changing conditions and assiduously avoiding any unnecessary risks. Your cooperation with our ongoing investigation would be entirely consistent with that established pattern of intelligent self-preservation." He was, in essence, offering me a stark choice: collaboration or continued futile resistance. While both paths inevitably led to the same ultimate destination, collaborators were deemed useful only as long as they provided genuinely valuable information, after which they swiftly became liabilities to be quietly and efficiently disposed of. Resistors, by contrast, were simply dispatched much more quickly and with considerably less ceremony. I opted for a third distinct path: complete and utter withdrawal from any and all activities that could potentially be interpreted as either cooperation with the authorities or participation in resistance. I attended no clandestine meetings, engaged in no conversations that might conceivably be construed as planning, and scrupulously avoided any associations that could even remotely be perceived as suspicious. I worked dutifully when assigned, fought brutally when summoned to the arena, and existed within the confines of my cell during all other hours like a deactivated machine powered down between its operational periods. This calculated strategy of strategic invisibility proved remarkably effective at deflecting official attention, but it came at the steep cost of complete and utter isolation from whatever fragmented remains of the prisoner community still existed. Other inmates, unnerved and uncertain whether I had become an informant or had simply lost my sanity entirely, began to actively avoid me. I thus became a spectral presence within the prison, present in body but utterly non-participating in spirit, technically alive but profoundly not truly living. The nascent resistance network was eventually and inevitably destroyed, a consequence of relentless investigation combined with insidious betrayal. Its members were either summarily executed or transferred to grim facilities boasting even more brutally repressive conditions. The administration, reveling in its victory, celebrated by imposing renewed and even tighter restrictions on prisoner movement and communication, implementing sophisticated surveillance measures that rendered any form of unauthorized association virtually impossible. Colonel Thorne summoned me to his austere office after the last of the conspirators had been systematically dealt with. He studied me with the cold, calculating expression of a man attempting to solve a perplexing puzzle that stubbornly refused to fit his conventional categories of understanding. 43 prisoners were implicated in these resistance activities, he stated, reading dispassionately from a report lying open on his desk. 43 individuals who deliberately chose to risk absolutely everything for the mere illusion of freedom or dignity or whatever ephemeral concept they deemed worth dying for. You, however, were conspicuously not among them, despite possessing both the unique skills and the established relationships that would undoubtedly have made you an exceptionally valuable recruit. He paused, his gaze fixed on me, clearly expecting me to explain my conspicuous absence from the conspiracy. But I had absolutely nothing to say that could possibly satisfy his insistent curiosity without simultaneously creating a fresh host of new problems for myself. Our intelligence suggests you are either the smartest prisoner in this entire facility or perhaps the most utterly broken, he continued, his tone devoid of emotion. Either way, you represent an exceptionally useful data point for our ongoing efforts to understand long-term adaptation to correctional environments. You will therefore be transferred to the research wing for extended observation and rigorous testing. The infamous research wing was situated deep within the most subterranean levels of Penitentia Maxima, its access rigorously controlled by multiple security checkpoints, each demanding several forms of layered authorization. The prisoners confined there were not merely inmates, but rather living subjects in continuous, highly classified experiments, all meticulously designed to enhance the efficiency of rehabilitation, punishment, and, most critically, control techniques. Some were volunteers, coerced by promises of marginally better conditions in exchange for their participation. Others were simply selected based on specific characteristics that rendered them uniquely suitable for particular, often chilling, research protocols. My new accommodations represented a noticeable improvement over standard prison cells. A larger space, superior lighting, precise temperature control, and even a small window offering an unsettling view into the vast underground caverns where waste processing and power generation equipment operated ceaselessly, 24 hours a day. These apparent improvements, however, were not gestures of kindness or benevolence. They were purely practical necessities, carefully calculated to maintain research subjects in optimal physical and mental condition over prolonged periods of experimentation. The rigorous testing commenced immediately, administered by specialized teams who meticulously measured every conceivable metric, from my raw reaction times and cognitive capacity to my stress responses and intrinsic pain tolerance. They were painstakingly mapping the profound changes that a decade of relentless imprisonment had wrought upon my mind and body, clinically documenting the insidious transformation from a functional citizen to a compliant, institutional artifact with chilling scientific precision. The subsequent physical examinations revealed the grim, accumulated damage of a decade spent breathing chemical-laden air, subsisting on bland synthetic food, and enduring frequent, casual violence. My lungs bore undeniable scarring from industrial pollutants. My bones had suffered significant density loss due to chronic poor nutrition, and my nervous system exhibited the precise kind of hypervigilance patterns typically observed in battle-hardened combat veterans. I had become a living catalog of institutional injuries, a stark, breathing record of precisely what prolonged exposure to correctional environments could inexorably accomplish. The psychological evaluations proved even more complex and intrusive, involving sophisticated tests designed to measure my residual capacity for empathy, social connection, moral reasoning, and emotional responsiveness. The researchers appeared particularly fascinated by my capacity for violence and the specific psychological mechanisms that had enabled me to kill other prisoners without displaying any apparent emotional distress or remorse. They administered intricate scenarios and simulations, each requiring me to make difficult choices between my own self-preservation and the welfare of others, meticulously recording my responses and the cold, pragmatic reasoning behind them. "Fascinating," one of the researchers murmured softly, almost to herself, as she reviewed my compiled test results. A complete erosion of conventional moral constraints, yet not achieved through psychopathy or anti-social personality development. The inhibitions have simply been supplanted by far more practical considerations, a survival-focused ethic rather than a socially focused one. They were studying me with the detached curiosity of scientists examining a specimen, meticulously documenting the successful transformation of a human being into something far more useful for the institution's pragmatic purposes. I had, in essence, become living proof that their brutal methods were undeniably effective. I was compelling evidence that any individual could be systematically broken down and then meticulously reconstructed according to administrative needs, provided the process was applied with sufficient patience and the requisite expertise. The other research subjects, a chilling collection of humanity, were all at various stages of the transformation I had by then already completed. Some were recent arrivals, still retaining just enough of their original personalities to offer nascent resistance to the testing protocols. Others were much further along the continuum, exhibiting the kind of mechanical, unthinking compliance that clearly indicated successful institutional adaptation. A terrifying few had progressed far beyond even my level of modification, essentially becoming biological machines that responded to external stimuli without the slightest trace of independent thought or genuine feeling. Dr. Helena Cross, the principal researcher assigned to my case, elucidated the profound purpose of their work during one of our regular, dispassionate interview sessions. She was a gaunt woman with prematurely graying hair and an intense, unwavering focus that hinted at a personal investment in her research that transcended mere professional obligation, bordering on obsession. The traditional model of incarceration erroneously assumes that punishment and deprivation alone will suffice to motivate meaningful behavioral change, she observed clinically, reviewing the detailed notes from my latest round of testing. But punishment, she continued, is inherently inefficient, demanding constant monitoring and relentless enforcement. What we are meticulously developing here is a far more elegant solution. Subjects who internalize institutional goals so profoundly and completely that any external control whatsoever becomes utterly superfluous. She was, with chilling detachment, describing the systematic creation of perfect prisoners, individuals who had been psychologically modified so fundamentally that they served institutional purposes without requiring constant surveillance or overt coercion. The groundbreaking research being conducted here, she explained, would eventually be applied to correctional facilities throughout the vast Imperium, ultimately forging a new generation of inmates who would self-police and even police each other, meticulously adhering to administrative preferences. You, specifically, represent our most unequivocally successful case study, she continued, her voice gaining a slight academic inflection. 10 years of systematic conditioning have meticulously produced an individual who functions optimally within strictly defined institutional parameters, yet still retains sufficient cognitive capacity to competently perform complex tasks. You are, in essence, a living template for the future of imperial justice itself. I ventured to ask her what precisely would become of me once the research was formally completed and my usefulness as a test subject inevitably expired. That naturally depends entirely on the results of our final comprehensive evaluations, she replied, unperturbed. Subjects who demonstrate stable, profound adaptation may be transferred to structured work programs where their enhanced skills can be utilized productively. Others, however, may be selected for advanced modification procedures meticulously designed to further enhance their institutional value. Advanced modification, as I understood it, was merely a euphemism for servitor conversion, the brutal, surgical excision of all personality and independent thought in favor of absolute mechanical obedience. I was, in essence, being offered a chilling choice between perpetual slavery and a metaphorical lobotomization. Though both options undeniably represented forms of death, differing only in their clinical efficiency and gruesome finality. The relentless research continued for many months, each day bringing fresh, increasingly invasive tests and evaluations, all meticulously designed to probe the deepest, most insidious dimensions of my transformation. They measured my nuanced responses to intricate moral dilemmas, complex social situations, and intense stress scenarios with the meticulous thoroughness of skilled cartographers mapping previously uncharted and treacherous territory. Every conceivable aspect of my psychology was rigorously documented, systematically categorized, and exhaustively analyzed, seeking profound insights that could be efficiently applied to future subjects. The final, most extreme phase of testing involved exposure to highly experimental conditioning techniques, specifically designed to profoundly enhance the modifications already achieved through a decade of conventional imprisonment. This included potent chemical treatments that fundamentally altered neurotransmitter function, invasive surgical procedures designed to strategically damage specific brain regions, and advanced behavioral therapies that relentlessly reinforced institutional loyalty through reward and punishment systems, far more sophisticated and insidious than anything deployed in the general prisoner population. I submitted to these increasingly extreme procedures without a flicker of resistance, for I had long understood that any opposition would have been both utterly futile and fundamentally counterproductive. The researchers meticulously noted my unwavering compliance in their official reports, choosing to describe it as irrefutable evidence of successful adaptation rather than merely simple, profound resignation. They were, it seemed, utterly incapable of conceiving a form of surrender so absolute, so all-encompassing, that it had become virtually indistinguishable from genuine cooperation. These advanced treatments yielded measurable, undeniable changes in my brain chemistry and overall cognitive function, meticulously fine-tuning the profound transformation that had been subtly occurring gradually over the preceding decade. My capacity for independent thought became increasingly limited. My emotional responses grew chillingly predictable, and my behavioral patterns became seamlessly consistent with institutional expectations. I was steadily becoming a more perfect version of the very entity the prison system had, from its inception, been striving to create. Dr. Cross appeared genuinely pleased with these profound results, though she consistently maintained the clinical, professional detachment appropriate for someone meticulously studying laboratory animals rather than actual human beings. During what would be our final interview, she expressed a clear satisfaction with the research outcomes and a palpable optimism regarding the broader, far-reaching applications of their groundbreaking work. The highly advanced techniques we've so painstakingly developed here will irrevocably revolutionize correctional practice throughout the entire Imperium, she declared, as she reviewed the comprehensive, chilling documentation of my case. Instead of merely warehousing criminals until they succumb to death or become prohibitively expensive to maintain, she explained, we will now be efficiently producing unequivocally loyal servants, individuals who can contribute productively and without question to imperial society. She then inquired if I had any lingering questions about the research or my integral role within it, as if my personal curiosity about my own systematic destruction was somehow a relevant consideration in her detached scientific calculations. I calmly asked her whether she genuinely believed the person who had first entered Penitentia Maxima 10 years prior would even recognize the utterly transformed thing I had now become. Probably not, she conceded after a moment of cold clinical consideration. But that initial person was, by definition, a criminal, one who actively threatened imperial stability through seditious behavior. The individual sitting patiently in front of me now, however, is a loyal subject who profoundly understands his proper assigned role within the social order. This transformation, by any reasonable standard, represents an undeniable improvement. From her chillingly pragmatic perspective, she was undeniably correct. The man who had once been arrested for daring to speak out against pervasive corruption had been efficiently replaced by something far more useful and infinitely less troublesome. The entire process had been meticulously efficient, comprehensively thorough, and, ultimately, completely successful in achieving its predetermined brutal goals. I stood as a chilling testament to the ruthless effectiveness of imperial justice, irrefutable proof that rehabilitation was indeed possible, provided one defined rehabilitation as the complete and utter erasure of all undesirable characteristics. The notification of my transfer arrived 3 days later, delivered by impassive guards who treated me with the same mechanical courtesy reserved for valuable, sensitive equipment, being relocated between different departments. I was being reassigned to a specialized work program on a distant agri-world, where my finely honed skills and advanced conditioning would be efficiently utilized for critical food production activities, essential to the vast imperial supply chains. The transport ship was filled with a silent multitude of other graduates from various correctional research programs, individuals modified in subtly different ways, but all sharing the singular, defining characteristic of complete and utter institutional compliance. We sat in profound communal silence during the long, monotonous journey. Each of us seemed lost within whatever fragmented remnants remained of our individual consciousnesses, no longer capable of the kind of meaningful communication that might once have offered comfort or companionship. The agri-world was named Demeet's Garden, a designation that ironically conjured images of abundance and natural beauty, but in reality described a bleak landscape stripped of everything except its raw capacity to relentlessly produce food for distant, uncaring populations. The very soil was utterly exhausted from generations of intensive, unforgiving farming. The water sources were heavily contaminated with noxious agricultural chemicals, and the ambient air carried the perpetual dusty smell of a world that had long since forgotten how to naturally sustain life without constant, invasive, artificial intervention. The sprawling work camps were scattered mercilessly across the planetary surface, each one rigidly focused on a distinct aspect of food production, from vast grain cultivation and efficient protein synthesis to the grim process of nutrient extraction from organic waste. The workers themselves were a desolate mixture of indentured servants, penal colonists, and research subjects like myself, all of them modified in various insidious ways to maximize their raw productivity while simultaneously minimizing their maintenance requirements. I was assigned to Camp 17, a massive facility that specialized in the intensive cultivation of protein-rich algae within vast artificial lakes that stretched seemingly without end, disappearing beyond the distant horizon. The work was relentlessly repetitive and utterly exhausting, involving the meticulous maintenance of complex filtration systems designed to keep the immense algae populations healthy, while simultaneously extracting the vital nutrients that would eventually be processed into sustenance for imperial citizens on far more fortunate worlds. The other workers were, for the most part, eerily silent, their individual personalities having been so completely erased or suppressed to the point where meaningful conversation was neither possible nor, it seemed, even necessary. We labored in lockstep according to rigid schedules programmed directly into neural implants, which precisely regulated our sleep cycles, nutrition intake, and raw labor output with chilling, mechanical precision. The camp administrators were remarkably few in number, largely because extensive supervision was deemed unnecessary when the workers themselves had been so thoroughly conditioned to effectively police themselves. Days blurred into months, and months into indistinguishable years, as we performed our assigned functions with the chilling, unwavering reliability of biological machinery. I meticulously maintained the filtration systems, harvested the teeming algae, and processed the extracted nutrients, all according to precise protocols that had been indelibly burned into my memory through endless repetition and relentless reinforcement. The work had become my singular existence, and existence itself was merely the work, a perfectly closed, self-sustaining loop that required no external motivation or even the faintest promise of reward. Sometimes, in those fleeting, liminal moments between sleep and full waking, I would recall vivid fragments of dreams that felt as though they belonged to someone else's distant life. Images of warm sunlight dappling through windows onto polished wooden floors, the innocent sound of children laughing freely, the genuine taste of food that had been lovingly prepared with care rather than coldly engineered for mere efficiency. These ephemeral memories felt like faint, spectral messages from a ghost. Communications from someone who had perished so long ago that even his very name had been utterly forgotten. But these fragile dreams invariably faded, dissolving swiftly under the harsh, unforgiving light of morning and the immediate, insistent requirements of yet another day's relentless labor. The person who had once experienced those fleeting moments of genuine joy and human connection was now as utterly distant from my current reality as the Emperor himself. A legendary figure from ancient history whose existence could be acknowledged but never truly or meaningfully comprehended. The years continued to pass, marked only by the subtle, inexorable changes in my aging body and the slow, gradual deterioration of the mechanical equipment I meticulously maintained. My hair, once dark, became completely white. My hands developed the persistent tremor that was the unavoidable consequence of decades of continuous exposure to harsh industrial chemicals. And my vision began its slow, inevitable failure, rendering detailed work increasingly arduous and painful. I was, irrevocably, becoming obsolete, a piece of biological machinery that was steadily wearing out and would eventually, inevitably, need to be replaced. The end, when it finally arrived, came not dramatically, but with a chilling bureaucratic efficiency. A routine medical evaluation dispassionately determined that my productivity had irretrievably declined below acceptable institutional thresholds, and that the cost of maintaining me in working condition now demonstrably exceeded the diminishing value of my continued labor. I was, therefore, scheduled for termination, a process guaranteed to be quick, entirely painless, and economically optimal for the facility's stringent operational requirements. They granted me 3 days to meticulously complete my final work assignments, ensuring that the transition to my replacement would be utterly smooth, and that absolutely no productivity would be lost during the inevitable changeover. I spent those final days performing the exact same tasks I had executed for years, diligently maintaining the very same equipment, meticulously following the identical protocols, as if absolutely nothing had changed, save for the arbitrary, looming deadline that now definitively marked the ultimate limits of my existence. On the final day, I was impassively escorted to a cold processing facility where other similarly obsolete workers waited their silent turn for termination. We sat in neatly ordered rows, like products awaiting their final journey on a conveyor belt, each of us tagged with precise identification numbers and processing codes that would ensure meticulously accurate record keeping during our systematic disposal. The room was filled with an unsettling quiet, broken only by the low, soft humming of unseen machinery and the occasional, almost imperceptible shuffle of feet, as another individual was called forward for processing. When my assigned number was finally announced, I stood without hesitation and walked calmly to the designated station, devoid of either fear or trepidation. The technician, who would perform the final procedure, was remarkably efficient and utterly professional, meticulously checking my identification tags and verifying the termination authorization before preparing the lethal injection that would swiftly stop my heart. She worked with the casual, practiced competence of someone who had performed this grim task hundreds, if not thousands, of times before. "Any final statements for the record?" she inquired blandly, more from ingrained habit than from any genuine interest in my eventual response. I quietly informed her that I had, in fact, been dead for 11 years, 7 months, and 22 days, and that I was, in a strange way, grateful they were finally allowing my body to catch up with the rest of me. She noted my response impassively in her logbook, then smoothly administered the injection. The potent chemical cocktail entered my bloodstream, swiftly beginning to shut down my vital systems with the same chilling efficiency that had characterized every other aspect of my protracted time in imperial custody. My vision slowly dimmed, my breathing grew shallow and labored, and my consciousness began its inevitable fade, like a flickering light being gently, inexorably extinguished. In those precious, fleeting final moments, as my brain ceased its futile attempts to process incoming sensory information, I experienced something profound that might, perhaps, have been peace. The relentless, constant vigilance that had defined my every waking moment for over a decade finally, mercifully relaxed. The endless, exhausting calculation of survival strategies became utterly irrelevant, and the crushing, soul-destroying weight of institutional compliance lifted from shoulders that would soon be still forever. The final thought that serenely crossed my dying mind was not one of regret or burning anger or primal fear, but rather a simple, profound observation that the Imperium had, with chilling perfection, achieved its ultimate goal with absolute efficiency. The man who had once dared to believe in the abstract concept of justice, who had spoken out against pervasive corruption, was utterly gone, replaced by something that had served imperial interests faithfully, diligently, until its utility had finally and completely expired. The entire system had functioned precisely as designed, transforming a perceived problem into a usable resource, and then with equal dispassion, disposing of that resource once it was no longer deemed necessary. My death, a mere bureaucratic formality, was recorded in the facility's operational logs as routine maintenance, accorded no more significance than the replacement of a worn-out filter or the disposal of contaminated, non-recyclable waste. The body that had housed 11 years of silent suffering was efficiently processed through the facility's organic recycling systems, its constituent nutrients eventually becoming fertilizer for the very algae farms where other modified workers would continue the relentless, endless cycle of production and consumption. Prison in the grim 41st millennium is not, in its essence, a place of punishment, but rather of profound transformation, not for correction, but for systematic consumption. It takes living human beings and ruthlessly converts them into something demonstrably more useful and infinitely less troublesome, relentlessly grinding away everything that once made life meaningful until only raw, unthinking function remains. This chilling process is meticulously efficient, remarkably cost-effective, and ultimately completely successful in achieving its predetermined, brutal goals. There exists no possibility of redemption within this unforgiving system, for redemption inherently implies the possibility of a return to a previous unblemished state, a concept rendered utterly impossible by the irreversible modifications inflicted upon prisoners, meticulously designed to be permanent. There is no true justice because justice demands the fundamental consideration of right and wrong, and institutional efficiency recognizes no moral categories whatsoever beyond the stark distinctions of productive and counterproductive. And there is absolutely no hope, because hope intrinsically depends upon the fragile belief that conditions might, however, incrementally improve. Yet the only change prisoners can ever expect is the gradual, inexorable decay that leads them inevitably from slavery to a final, permanent death. The guards, the administrators, the cold researchers who operate these grim facilities are not in themselves inherent monsters. Though they routinely perform monstrous tasks, they are merely diligent servants of a vast, unfeeling system that has meticulously calculated the most efficient and ruthless methods for converting perceived human problems into tangible human resources. And they execute their duties with the same detached, professional competence that chillingly characterizes all aspects of imperial bureaucracy. Evil, within this terrifying context, is not a matter of individual malice or personal cruelty, but rather the stark, remorseless, institutional logic carried to its absolute, inevitable conclusion. Those unfortunate souls who enter imperial prisons leave behind absolutely everything that once defined them as human, save for the most basic biological functions that can be efficiently harnessed for productive labor. Their minds are systematically stripped of all independence. Their bodies are ruthlessly modified for optimal performance, and their spirits are crushed so completely, so utterly, that the very concept of resistance becomes literally unthinkable, an alien notion. They become, in every sense, perfect prisoners, completely compliant, utterly predictable, and entirely, chillingly disposable. This, then, is the stark, brutal reality of justice within the imperium of man. A vast, unfeeling system that has long since abandoned the mere pretense of rehabilitation in favor of simple, efficient resource extraction. Prisoners are reduced to nothing more than raw material to be processed, not citizens to be corrected or reformed. Their ultimate fate is determined not by the nature or severity of their original crimes, but solely by the cold, unforgiving efficiency requirements of institutional operation. The man I had once been, before my arrest and subsequent transformation, would never, could never, recognize the thing I ultimately became. And perhaps, in a profoundly twisted way, that represents a perverse form of mercy. For the complete erasure of identity meticulously eliminates the profound suffering that would inevitably arise from remembering what was irrevocably lost. The perfect prisoner feels no sorrow, no grief whatsoever, for his utterly destroyed humanity, precisely because he has completely forgotten that such a concept as humanity ever even existed. In the end, imperial justice achieves its cold, absolute goals with terrifying efficiency. The systematic elimination of all perceived threats to social stability through the complete and irreversible transformation of threatening individuals into effortlessly useful resources. The process is undeniably brutal, yet meticulously thorough, remarkably cost-effective, yet chillingly comprehensive. It serves the Imperium's insatiable needs perfectly, even as it utterly destroys everything that might once have made those needs questionable or morally objectionable. This, ultimately, is what prison truly means in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium. Not a place for punishment or even the pretense of rehabilitation, but a relentless factory that takes already broken people and systematically breaks them down even more thoroughly, until they become precisely what the unfeeling system needs them to be. And when they are finally deemed no longer useful, even in their thoroughly broken state, they are discarded with the exact same chilling efficiency that characterized their initial, brutal transformation. There is no escape from. This system's insidious power lies in its capacity not merely to imprison the physical body, but to fundamentally dismantle and reconstruct the very essence of the mind. Resistance becomes an impossibility, for it demands an intact sense of self, a core identity that this relentless process systematically erodes and ultimately obliterates. Hope, too, is extinguished, as it is predicated upon the existence of possibilities, pathways to an alternative future, which the system is meticulously engineered to eradicate entirely. Thus, the solitary truth that persisted, the ultimate revelation that dawned upon me in my terminal moments was this: that death, when its inevitable embrace finally arrived, signaled not an ultimate defeat, but rather a profound and absolute completion. For the system attains its most pristine and chilling victory, not through the crude act of execution, but when its subjects are so irrevocably altered, so thoroughly transformed from within, that their physical demise becomes utterly superfluous. My own death, then, was nothing more than the final ceremonial step in a comprehensive process that had, in fact, reached its grim fruition years prior. It was merely the disposal of a remnant, a spent vessel, after it had fulfilled its every intended function.